So a lot of people have the question, who is the biggest star in boxing coming up? After Canelo, who is going to carry the mantle for the biggest star in boxing? You know, the ironic thing is we always kind of already know that as the former fighter of the generation is ending. You know, as Floyd and Pacquiao were coming to an end, we're starting to wonder though, who is the next generation? You know, it's kind of interesting. You know, I remember thinking about, you know, Oscar being the star before this, and thinking, you know, after Oscar, who could be the star? And, you know, suddenly Floyd beats Oscar, and suddenly, you know, you get this sort of passing of the torch, and Floyd became the megastar of boxing after that, and kind of carried the sport, and his name was synonymous when you mentioned the word boxing. So you always have a guy like that, you know, and you kind of knew, even during Floyd's reign at the top of the sport, as the guy who was carrying the sport, that Canelo was going to be next. You always knew that. I can remember Canelo's name being mentioned when he was like 19 years old, and already he was being mentioned as a possible opponent for Floyd Mayweather. So you kind of already knew that there was a guy kind of waiting in the wings that was going to sort of take over the sport, be the next star, if he lived up to the hype. And in this case, as Canelo enters his 30s, you know, he's now 31 years old. We start to wonder, who is the next guy? Usually by now we kind of see it, and I don't know, man. I don't know. You know, we have the 60s and into the 70s, Ali, right? As the 70s kind of waned out, we had Sugar Ray Leonard, and even into the early 80s, it was Ray Leonard. Great with respect to Larry Holmes, who was a great champion, but just, you know, personality-wise, didn't carry the sport the same way Leonard did. As we moved on into the late 80s, we saw Mike Tyson take over the sport, and really, in a profound way, in just a few years, he became the monster name of the sport, and the whole world was talking about him. That's sort of my entrance into the boxing fray, where my mind can kind of remembers such an iconic name, an iconic figure. It was Mike Tyson. As I was growing up, 7, 8 years old, and just waking up the morning of a Tyson fight was like the most unbelievable thing in the world at that time. As we entered into the 90s, started to create, you know, Tyson was arrested, and it was sort of a void there. You know, the heavyweight division was still exciting, but there was a void as to who the star of boxing would be. And suddenly, 1992, the Olympics come around, Oscar De La Hoya is there. And boom, this guy becomes a star. With respect to Roy Jones, who was becoming, at the time, the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport. Julio Cesar Chavez was a big star. Whitaker, though, seemed to unseat him as a top fighter, but never quite got the popularity of a Chavez. So you were looking for that popularity, because when you talk about the top of the sport, you're not just looking for necessarily the best fighter. That can be a whole different debate. Sometimes it goes together. You know, right now, you know, there's a debate. Canelo could be the best fighter in the sport. A lot of people think so. I don't really argue it, although I think Terence Crawford is the best. I wouldn't crazy argue with you if you tell me Canelo's the best in the sport. And, you know, he's also the most popular guy in the sport, right? So sometimes it goes together and sometimes it doesn't. And I think as we started to get into those mid-90s, you know, as we started to come out of the early 90s with Whitaker beating Chavez, you had Whitaker was becoming the top of the sport, right? Roy Jones was also starting to come into his own and getting closer to pound-for-pound top, and eventually did get to the pound-for-pound top level, but we didn't have that star power with those guys, not the same way as you would have a guy who kind of carries the sport. And then all of a sudden, Oscar just came into his own. You know, he was already winning world championships probably 2-3 years into his professional boxing career, and he had this Golden Boy moniker, and everybody was going crazy for him. Girls, guys, it was a tremendous rise, a meteoric rise, you know, and that turned out to be, you know, the thing that made him the star. But as Oscar was coming along, you started seeing Floyd Mayweather had his potential. You know, you started seeing this phenomenal talent. You know, could be a little bit controversial. You weren't sure if he was going to be able to become the star of the sport, but you knew he was going to be the goods, you know? And then suddenly he beats Oscar De La Hoya, and he just takes off right from there, you know? We already recognize him as a great fighter, but now we recognize him as a great star, you know? With respect to Manny Pacquiao, who also made himself a pretty big star along the same time frame, and you know, there could be a debate of, you might think Pacquiao was a bigger star, you know, but for all intents and purposes, we'll say Floyd was the biggest star of that time. And now we've got Canelo, but who comes after Canelo? It's still a big debate. You know, I think for the first time in our boxing history, we're looking at a situation where the biggest star in boxing may not even necessarily be the most popular boxer. Obviously, the biggest star has to be popular. The best boxer, or anywhere near the best boxer. I'm thinking, there's good fighters. This is not about who the best fighter is. Again, sometimes it does go hand in hand, but it's not always the case. Right now, if you ask me right now to pick a guy who's young and is going to be a mega star in boxing, or who has the potential to be a mega star in boxing, and can carry the eyeballs, is good enough to carry the eyeballs, bro, it's Jake Paul. It's crazy, bro. Prove me different, right? Tell me there's a young guy on that kind of popularity level who's also good. Because I kind of want to wish there was, right? I want to hope that there was and say, this guy can carry the sport because he's going to be competing and vying for the top spot in the sport pound for pound, and he's also going to be a huge megastar. That's usually how we kind of try to fit it, Usually when we talk about the best fighter in the sport, he's at least in the pound for pound list, so to speak. Jake Paul will never be on the pound for pound list. He'll never even be close to that. But Jake Paul right now, as far as young guys on the rise with the potential to be stars, and this is with big respect to Xander Zayas, who I really, really think has a lot of potential. But Jake Paul right now, for that young group, might be the biggest young star on the rise. And may be the guy that becomes synonymous with the sport of boxing. I'm not telling you might like it or dislike. You're going to like it or dislike it. You may really dislike what I'm saying. Shoot, I might not even like what I'm saying. But at the end of the day, I got to be real with myself. And again, I think there's with respect to Xander Zayas, who is a guy coming up the ladder who I think has the potential, if marketed right, and Top Rank always does a good job of marketing future stars and turning them into stars. Xander Zayas could possibly be the boxing guy that actually makes you say, get out of here, Jake Paul. You know what I'm saying? You might be popular, but I'm going to be super popular, and I'm actually going to vie for the top spot in the sport as well, pound for pound. If there's a guy with the potential that has both sides of that package, I would pick Xander Zayas. But right now, I'm looking at, as far as potential of popularity, which is what makes the biggest star. You want to hope that the skill level does go into it, but popularity is the be-all end-all when it comes to the biggest star in the sport. The things that we talk about, what makes a guy so popular. Canelo, for example, just, you got to have that bargaining chip, which is you put asses in seats. And Canelo always got people's asses in seats, got people to tune in. It helps that you come from a culture that really backs boxing, that really pays for boxing, because sometimes guys come from a culture that loves boxing, but does that culture pay for boxing? Mexicans and Puerto Ricans tend to pay for boxing. I mean, these people pay for boxing, So they create stars. When they got a guy from one of those places and he becomes an excellent good fighter, the fans from that region start to get really, really behind him. And because the Hispanic culture is so festive and so exuberant in that way, I think, this is my personal opinion, I think their enthusiasm starts to rub off on other cultures and makes them excited about these kind of fighters as well. So anytime you see a very, very good Mexican fighter and the whole of Mexico gets behind him, and we've seen a lot of this. We've seen this with Chavez and even De La Hoya with the Mexican and Mexican Americans. You start to get a guy who kind of carries that mantle, and he sort of starts to transcend not just his own culture, but he starts to transcend all the cultures and becomes a megastar in boxing. So I think the things that make Canelo popular, obviously, are that kind of popularity. Started with his own ethnicity and has now carried over. And that also is with respect to Anthony Joshua, who's right underneath him. And then Canelo, once it carried over, I mean, now everybody's curious for Canelo Alvarez fight. Everybody knows who Canelo Alvarez is. Whether you watch boxing or not, everybody knows who Canelo Alvarez is. And that's kind of what I view and how I judge if a guy is the marquee moniker name in boxing. Is even people who don't watch boxing, if you mention his name, do people know who he is? If you think about it, that's kind of the way it's got to be. Ali, even if you didn't watch boxing, everybody knew who he was. Sugar Ray Leonard, if you didn't watch boxing, everybody knew who he was. Iron Mike Tyson, his time, even if you didn't watch boxing, you knew somebody that was talking about Mike Tyson. Trust me, at that point, I was alive, I was a kid, and even us little kids at lunchtime at the lunch table talking about the Tyson fight that happened on Saturday. I still remember my friend, I was in 4th grade, and talking about Mike Tyson with Frank Bruno the first time. And as kids, you just get really you're really impressionable. And I remember my friend saying, at lunch table. Man, that was crazy. Another uppercut or two, and Tyson would have killed Bruno because of all those uppercuts he was hitting him with. You know, because we as kids, we were so impressionable. We were like, oh man, it really was. It was that bad. You know, it was that crazy. You know, so you make that kind of impression on kids, on fans, on crossover fans, even on non-boxing fans, and that's sort of the thing we're looking for. And that's the thing that makes Canelo Alvarez a star today. Everybody talks about him. You know, when you mention boxing, everybody knows who Canelo Alvarez is. You mention Canelo Alvarez to somebody who may never even have watched boxing, they know who Canelo Alvarez is. That's the star. They'll know who Floyd Mayweather was. They'll know who Oscar De La Hoya was. You know, in their prospective times, everybody knew those guys. Now, that brings us to Jake Paul, and that's where, fortunately, unfortunately, depends who you're speaking to, he becomes the guy everybody knows. And now thanks to the internet and thanks to all this social media and all this technology, everybody knows Jake Paul fights. Everybody knows Jake Paul boxes. So now you've got people that are not boxing fans. You ask them about a boxer, they might know who Canelo Alvarez is, but you're starting to get a certain kind of fan that are starting to say, when you think of a boxer, who's your first guy that comes to your mind? There's a certain kind of fan now that will tell you Jake Paul, you know? So I think that potentially makes him that next star coming into the next phase as boxing moves on into the next generation for the post Canelo Alvarez years. We're not there yet. Canelo still has a good amount of prime left, I think, at least a few years, but you gotta start already thinking about this. Another wild card besides Xander Zayas could be Ryan Garcia. He is a guy who has a major social media following, has a lot of potential, is a very, very good fighter. And popularity-wise, you know, I'll tell you this, popularity-wise, he could be that guy to carry the moniker. But you know, it's hard for me because if Ryan Garcia treats his career like a Jake Paul, will he disappoint the boxing fans? Because I think Ryan Garcia could go the Jake Paul route, you know, and not necessarily fight the best competition. Jake really doesn't have a choice. He'd get beat if he fought good competition. But I think if Ryan Garcia fought subpar opposition, in this social media generation, I still think he could become some kind of star, you know, because he still just has that crazy crossover fan base, and I think it would only grow if he stayed busy. But it's weird because I feel like the boxing fans would be disappointed in a guy like that because he has the potential to be more than just that niche guy. That guy who just kind of takes on the subpar opposition because he's not good enough, but you got to keep him winning because he's popular. I think Ryan is actually good enough to where he could actually compete for the pound-for-pound level, pound-for-pound top spot at one point in his career. He's young, he's very good, he's promotable, he can fight, he can punch. He's got a personality. It's hard for me to place him. So, I mean, respectful name. I still go with Jake Paul, but respectable names with honorable mention, we'll say. Ryan Garcia, Xander Zayas, those are the honorable mentions. But I'm going to go with Jake Paul right now, in this moment, right now. When you look at who's the next boxing star, and again, we're not going with necessarily might be the best, but boxing star, Jake Paul is after Canelo Alvarez. Waiting in the wings. We'll see if he's the guy.